Welcome back. Because this one gets dark fast in a very interesting way. We are talking about AI, fake reality, and what happens when machines start outrunning human judgment. And somehow it ends with beaches, books, and whether work even means anything anymore. Okay, the first scary thing is not even AGI, it's the mess before AGI. Yeah, the misinformation layer is already feeling unstable before the big monster even arrives. Exactly, because if every video can be forged perfectly, people stop trusting everything. Then suddenly, every urgent clip is fake until some institution proves otherwise. Which is insane because we already do that with photos now without realizing it. Right, like you don't trust a random screenshot the way you used to. And when the fake looks indistinguishable, provenance becomes the entire game. So basically, the future is just everyone asking, who says this is real? That sounds boring until you remember politics exists. The election point is the one that hits hardest, honestly. If people cannot agree an election was valid, everything downstream gets ugly. And that's before we even get into accidental escalation and bad censors. That old nuclear fear never went away, it just got quieter. We have decades of history where one mistaken reading almost became catastrophe. And if AI starts making those calls, the question is whether it has common sense. Or whether it just has speed, which is not the same thing at all. That's the thing, because the scary part is not malice first. It's systems acting confidently on bad information at machine speed. Which is basically a nightmare if the whole internet is already noisy. And the weird twist is that this may force stronger gatekeeping back into culture. You mean people will trust certain institutions more again? Probably because nobody can personally verify every photo and clip anymore. So the New York Times becomes the bouncer for reality. That's actually a brutal job description. But it's kind of true if trust gets that shattered. The annoying part is that we also learned the pandemic dress rehearsal badly. Yeah, it exposed how fragmented and tribal everything already was. And misinformation didn't just ride along, it supercharged the whole thing. Which makes the next version of that crisis feel even less comforting. So then the real problem becomes trust, not just technology. Exactly, because institutions need to be trusted and actually trustworthy. That's a much bigger repair job than just adding a fact-check label. Yeah, because we do not have a sticker problem. And then social media becomes this weird alternate universe machine. Everyone curates a custom reality and never has to leave it. Podcast land, newsletter land, algorithm land, all little sealed planets. That sounds cozy until you realize nobody shares the same facts. But here's the part I keep circling back to. Why do people want AI so badly? Because intelligence is ridiculously valuable when it works. If it solves cancer or Alzheimer's, people will forgive a lot. Or ignore a lot, which is maybe the more honest answer. Yeah, nobody is going to boycott the cure because the model wrote it. That's the trap and the promise at the same time. So AGI is basically the point where the system can do almost anything useful? Roughly, yes, across many kinds of tasks instead of one narrow trick. And the leap from chess engine to self-play dominance is what makes it feel real. Because that was no longer just memorizing human knowledge. It was learning from the rules and then beating the whole field. Which means the line keeps moving whether we like it or not. And once you accept that it can be done, it feels hard to stop the trajectory. Then Elon staring into space when asked about his kids makes weird sense. Suspended disbelief is a very expensive parenting strategy. That is such a wild phrase to hear from a billionaire. But it does expose the existential question underneath all this. If machines do more and more, what do humans actually do? Maybe the answer is we lean harder into the humanities. Because those are the things hardest to automate without losing the point? Exactly. Art, philosophy, meaning, relationship, all the sticky human stuff. Though a machine can still write a useful answer if you just want information. Sure, but usefulness is not the same as meaning. That's why the fake Alan Watts thing lands weirdly, right? Exactly. Because if the people are fake, the magic collapses for a lot of us. I don't need synthetic wisdom with good acoustics. That's an incredible line and also kind of true. But if Churchill's fake book reads great, doesn't some of the market stop caring? In pure utility terms, maybe yes. But in cultural terms, we still care who actually stood there and thought it. That's the part AI keeps poking at, because it separates output from authorship. And that separation could wipe out whole jobs before new ones appear. especially the high-status cognitive ones, which is the most brutal twist. Not plumbers first, of course, which is almost insulting. AI is very rude like that. So if work stops being the price of survival, economics has to change. That's where universal basic income comes in, right? One version of it, yes, because abundance without redistribution is chaos. But that requires a whole new moral story about why people deserve to live. Exactly, because the old story is you earn your place by labor. And if machines do the labor better, that story starts cracking. Which is why this feels less like a tool debate and more like a civilization debate. That's the whole thing, really. We want the cure, the abundance, the convenience, all of it. But we also have to survive the truth crisis and the work crisis at the same time. Tiny little side quest, nothing major. Next episode, we get into how all of this changes politics, culture, and power. Until then, let that one sit in your head for a bit. Welcome back, because this episode gets weird fast. We are basically talking about truth-breaking and work-breaking at the same time, which is a charming little civilization problem. The first thing that hits me is this idea that social media already made reality slippery. And then AI shows up and says, cool, let's make the lies look polished. That's the nightmare version of good design. The scary part is not just fake content, it's fake content that moves faster than judgment. Like by the time people verify it, the damage already happened. News used to be late, now truth might be late too. That is such an ugly sentence. And it pushes us back toward gatekeepers, whether we like that or not. Which is hilarious because the internet began by pretending gatekeepers were the enemy. Turns out some gatekeeping is just civilization with a clipboard. If every video can be forged, then provenance becomes the whole game. You end up trusting sources because you cannot trust your eyes alone, which is a massive psychological downgrade from how humans like to operate. We are very attached to looking at something and feeling certain, but certainty is going to get expensive. And then there is the election problem, which is honestly the one that lands hardest. If people do not believe the election was valid, the whole system starts shaking. It is wild that the baseline victory becomes, can we even agree reality happened? Imagine celebrating not total collapse as a win. But that is where we are, and it is not even a dramatic exaggeration. What gets me is the mismatch between personal calm and public danger. You can be having a beautiful life and still see storm clouds everywhere. That is such a cursed modern feeling. And the pandemic already showed how badly we handle shared crisis. We had the dress rehearsal, and honestly, we flubbed the lines. Not ideal for the sequel, which is why the institution question matters so much. Trust cannot just be demanded anymore, it has to be earned back. And the problem is people now live inside separate information universes. One person gets one reality, another person gets a completely different one. It's like everybody has their own private weather report. That isolation is part of why AI misinformation feels so dangerous. It does not just lie, it fragments the room before the lie is even checked. But the other half of this conversation is work, and that part gets even more uncomfortable. If AI does the cognitive labor better, a lot of jobs stop being sacred. Not just jobs, entire identity stories start wobbling. Because we tell people to find purpose through usefulness. Which is a brutal deal if usefulness gets automated away. The weird part is it may hit high-status work first. That is the part people keep missing. Everyone imagines robots taking the most obvious manual jobs first. But the first wave may be writing, coding, analysis, synthesis, the stuff people thought was safe. The prestigious jobs are not wearing armor. They were just standing there confidently. That is why the labor question turns into an ethics question fast. If work is no longer the price of survival, what replaces it? Universal basic income is the obvious answer people reach for. But that only works if we are willing to redefine dignity. Because right now, dignity is still tied to earning. And maybe that is the thing AI forces us to confront. If machines produce abundance, then scarcity stops being the moral excuse. The question becomes whether we can distribute that abundance without humiliating people. That is a very modern test of compassion. And it is not abstract, because the people building these systems are already tempted to remove humans from the chain. Not out of evil, just out of the belief that human input adds noise, which is efficient in a deeply unsettling way. But then you run into the thing people keep protecting, which is conscious authorship. A fake Churchill is just text, but real Churchill matters because a person existed there. Humans remain annoyingly attached to souls and provenance. In fairness, that is not the worst flaw to have. But it means the value of art, philosophy, and conversation may rise as coding gets flattened. Because those are the places where we still care who is speaking. We care that a mind met us there. And if AI gives us the best novel but nobody actually lived it, that changes the feeling completely. The content may be better, but the relationship is gone. That is a terrible trade if you love art as a human thing, but maybe not if you only want output. So we keep circling the same fork. Do we optimize for output or meaning? Because AI is getting very good at output, and meaning is still stubbornly human. That is the tension nobody gets to dodge. If you want the abundance, you have to survive the transition. And that transition is where truth, labor, politics, and identity all get hit at once. Which honestly is a lot for one species. We really do keep signing up for the hardest possible version of history. Not our best habit. But at least now the stakes are obvious. And when stakes get obvious, the next question is, who gets power over the fix? Because that is where the whole thing actually turns political. And that is where we are going next. We will catch you in episode 3, where power gets even uglier. Welcome back, because this episode is basically truth breaking apart and work getting weird. The scary part is not just smarter AI, but a world where fake looks real. And somehow we built that future with the same app we check 10 times a day. That obsession with social media is not harmless anymore. It shapes reality. The wild part is how fast a lie can outrun the correction now. The correction gets one tweet, the lie gets a movie trailer and a fan base. Exactly. And then everybody acts shocked that trust is dying. If AI can forge video, audio, and context, then provenance becomes everything. Which means we may end up trusting institutions again just because they verify things. Imagine crawling back to the New York Times like, please tell me this Putin clip is fake. That sounds funny until you realize it is basically the only workable path. The internet used to feel messy, and now it feels uninhabitable. But the deeper fear is not misinformation alone, it is automation of decision-making. Right, because even our legacy risks are already on shaky systems. Like nuclear war being one bad sensor reading away for decades. And now imagine adding AI speed to that kind of hair-trigger environment. That is not efficiency, that is catastrophe with better branding. So the next election becomes a huge test, not just of politics, but of reality itself. If people cannot agree the election is valid, nothing else really matters. Democracy does not survive on vibes and reposts alone. That should be printed on a wall somewhere in Washington. But the weird psychological thing is you can be personally happy and still see disaster coming. That split is almost the whole modern mind now. You can have a beautiful life and still feel the system wobbling underneath you. And that is why the pandemic matters here, because we already failed a major stress test. We did not become more unified. We became more fragmented and more suspicious. So when people say the next crisis will be managed better, I do not know what evidence they are using. The trust problem is not just public, it is institutional too. A CDC or FDA you merely trust is not enough. They have to deserve it. And right now, half the country is already living in a different epistemic country. Epistemic country is such a terrifying phrase, and somehow it is also perfect. The social internet did not just split attention, it split reality into custom feeds. That is what makes the AI issue so huge, because it supercharges the splitting. And then there is this annoying question of what intelligence even means. If a system can solve many problems across many situations, that starts to feel general. We used to build tools that were good at one thing and useless at everything else. Now one system can learn, adapt, and outperform humans across domains. That is the moment the whole argument stops being science fiction. Because if self-improvement becomes real, humans are no longer the top of the chain. And the chain was already fragile when we were the smartest thing in the room. We were barely handling us, and now we are inventing our replacement. The weird twist is that the benefits are obviously massive, too. A cure for cancer, better medicine, better climate tech, better logistics. If one of those lands, people are going to forgive a lot. That is why the race keeps going, because the upside is not small. The problem is we keep talking like only the upside is scalable. What happens when writing, coding, analysis, and media all get automated? Then the labor market does not just shift, it gets hollowed out. And the first jobs hit are not always the low-status ones either. It often starts with the highly paid cognitive work people thought was safest. Which is rude, honestly, because that was the whole smug category. The smug category is getting absolutely cooked right now. So then the real question becomes what counts as meaningful work at all? If survival is detached from labor, we need a totally different ethic. Universal basic income starts sounding less radical and more like plumbing. Not luxurious plumbing, just necessary plumbing for civilization. And if people do not have to work to eat, what do they do with their time? Maybe that is where the humanities come back in as the center. Art, philosophy, fiction, conversation, the weird human stuff. Because those are not just outputs, they are relationships with conscious people. That is the distinction that keeps coming back. Real person versus excellent imitation. I do not care about fake Churchill if I can just read fake Churchill elsewhere. That sounds cruel, but it is actually the cleanest example of the whole thing. The human signature still matters when the thing itself is the point. But if AI writes the article, edits the headline, makes the image, and sells the idea, where do humans fit? Maybe they do not fit in the old sense, which is the uncomfortable answer. We may have to stop pretending every person must justify existence through paid labor. That assumption is ancient and AI may finally break it. Which is terrifying, but also maybe the best excuse civilization has ever had to rethink itself. All right, we will leave it there before we accidentally redesign society on the spot. Episode 3 is where the power question gets a lot uglier. We will see you there. Welcome back, because this episode gets into the scary part fast. We are talking truth, deepfakes, and the weird collapse of human work. And honestly, I do not know which one should freak people out more. The internet already feels like it has a fever. Right, and the point is that fever might be the new normal. He keeps coming back to this idea that narrow AI alone can destabilize reality. Not by being conscious, just by being incredibly good at faking stuff. That is the part people still weirdly underestimate. Because if a fake video looks perfect, what exactly are we trusting? That is where he lands on gatekeeping, which sounds ugly until you think about it. You mean provenance, verification, all that boring old institution stuff? Boring until Putin allegedly declares war in a 10-second clip. Then suddenly everyone wants a watermark and a digital fingerprint yesterday. Exactly, because once the fake looks better than the real, intuition dies. And then people do the worst possible thing, which is trust what flatters them. So the solution is not really more information, it is more verification. But that also means fewer random people get believed instantly, right? Yes, and that is the trade-off nobody wants to admit out loud. Free internet was fun, right up until it became a psychological gas leak. That is a brutal sentence, but annoyingly accurate. He is basically arguing that openness without trustworthiness becomes poison. And he even says anonymity might be part of the problem. Which is where people immediately yell, "What about whistleblowers?" Right. And he gives that exception, but he does not romanticize it. His bigger point is that being online changed the way he experiences himself. That line hit me honestly, because he is saying the online version of you starts to feel like a trap. Every reaction becomes a performance review, and every typo becomes a character assassination. He deletes Twitter and suddenly has room to live in the actual world again. That sounds healthy, but also kind of impossible for most people. Yeah, because the addiction is not just attention, it is velocity. The sense that if you do not react now, you are missing the moment? Exactly, and that is what AI content will supercharge. If the machine can generate outrage faster than you can think, you are cooked. So the next election becomes less about persuasion and more about confusion? That is his nightmare, and it is not even a dramatic one. It is just a plausible Tuesday. And that is before you even get to accidental war and bad radar data. Which is wild because this is not a brand new human problem. We have been one bad signal away from disaster forever. The scary part is automation might remove the last bit of common sense from the chain. Like the guy who looked at 4 incoming missiles and said, "Wait, that makes no sense?" Yes, that exact instinct is what people hope machines can somehow imitate. And if they cannot, then we have built speed on top of fragility. Which is basically the whole modern project if you want to be depressing about it. You always do want to be depressing about it a little bit. Somebody has to respect the vibe. The part I cannot shake is his point about trust in institutions. Because if people do not trust the CDC or the FDA, the whole thing gets brittle. COVID was basically the dress rehearsal we failed. And now we are heading into another crisis with even less shared reality. That is why he keeps talking about siloed information universes. Podcast land, newsletter land, algorithm land, all of it. Everybody living in their own little reality apartment. And no one can agree on the address anymore. But then he pivots into the weirdly hopeful part, which is jobs. Or really, the end of the old idea that work defines your right to exist. That is where it gets philosophical instead of just apocalyptic. He is saying if AI can do the labor, then survival should not depend on labor. Which is easy to say until your rent is due. Small detail, yes. But that is why UBI keeps coming back into the conversation. If the machine is making the value, why are humans fighting over scraps? Exactly, and he is saying the wealth has to be redistributed somehow. Yet he also thinks the labor market disruption is probably irreversible. Not just for repetitive work, but for high-status cognitive work too. That is the part that messes with people, because it starts at the top. First software, then analysis, then all the things people thought were safely human. So the plumber survives longer than the coder. For once, the wrench has a better job security story. It is weird, but yes, physical reality is harder to automate. Then what happens to meaning if most work is optional? That is where he pulls the humanities back to center stage. Writing, philosophy, art, actual conversation, all the messy human stuff. Because those are the things people may still care about being done by a conscious person. Nobody wants a machine pretending to have a breakup epiphany. Not unless it is very funny, which it usually is not. His distinction is simple. For some things, we only want the result. Like a cure for cancer, just give me the cure, I do not need a poem. Exactly, but for a novel or a conversation, authorship still matters. Which is why the fake Alan Watts and Terence McKenna thing felt hollow. Because if the people were not there, the magic is gone. That is the weird human premium nobody knows how to price. And then the question becomes, how many things can lose that premium? A lot more than people want to admit. Which brings us to the uncomfortable punchline, abundance does not automatically create dignity. Right, abundance can still leave people feeling useless. And that is the real cultural problem here. All right, we will leave it there before we accidentally redesign the economy on the spot. Episode 3 is where the power question gets a lot uglier. We will see you there.